talk about the transformed media landscape and what it means for anybody who has a message that they want to get out to anywhere in the world. And I want to illustrate that by telling a couple of stories about that transformation. I'll start here. Last November, there was a presidential election. You probably read something about it in the papers. And there was some concern that in some parts of the country there might be voter suppression. And so a plan came up to video the vote. And the idea was that individual citizens with phones capable of taking photos or making video would document their polling places on the lookout for any kind of voter suppression techniques and would upload this to a central place, and that this would operate as a kind of citizen observation, that citizens would not be there just to cast individual votes, but also to help ensure the sanctity of the vote overall. Right? So this is a pattern that assumes we're all in this together. What matters here isn't technical capital. It's social capital. These tools don't get socially interesting until they get technologically boring. It isn't when the shiny new tools show up that their uses start permeating society. It's when everybody is able to take them for granted. Because now that media is increasingly social, innovation can happen anywhere that people can take for granted the idea that we're all in this together. And so we're starting to see a media landscape in which innovation is happening everywhere and moving from one spot to another. That is a huge transformation. Not to put too fine a point on it, the moment we're living through, the moment our historical generation is living through, is the largest increase in expressive capability in human history. Now that's a big claim. I'm going to try and back it up. There are only 4 periods in the last 500 years where media has changed enough to qualify for the label revolution. The first one is the famous one, the printing press. Movable type, oil-based inks, that whole complex of innovations that made printing possible and turned Europe upside down starting in the middle of the 1400s. Then, a couple of hundred years ago, there was innovation in two-way communication, conversational media. First the telegraph, then the telephone. Slow, text-based conversations, then real-time voice-based conversations. Then about 150 years ago, there was a revolution in recorded media other than print. First photos, then recorded sound, then movies, all encoded into physical objects. And finally, about 100 years ago, the harnessing of electromagnetic spectrum to send sound and images through the air, radio and television. This is the media landscape as we knew it in the 20th century. This is what those of us of a certain age grew up with and are used to. But there's a curious asymmetry here. The media that's good at creating conversations is no good at creating groups, and the media that's good at creating groups is no good at creating conversations. If you want to have a conversation in this world, you have it with one other person. If you want to address a group, you get the same message and you give it to everybody in the group, whether you're doing that with a broadcasting tower or a printing press. That was the media landscape as we had it in the 20th century. And this is what changed. This thing that looks like a peacock hit a windscreen is Bill Cheswick's map of the internet. He traces the edges of the individual networks and then color codes them. The internet is the first medium in history that has native support for groups and conversation at the same time. Whereas the phone gave us the one-to-one pattern, and television, radio, magazines, books gave us the one-to-many pattern. The internet gives us the many-to-many pattern. Right? For the first time, media is natively good at supporting these kinds of conversations. That's one of the big changes. The second big change, right, is that as all media gets digitized, the internet also becomes the mode of carriage for all other media, meaning that phone calls migrate to the internet, magazines migrate to the internet, movies migrate to the internet. And that means that every medium is right next door to every other medium. Right? Put another way, media is increasingly less just a source of information and is increasingly more a site of coordination, because groups that see or hear or watch or listen to something can now gather around and talk to each other as well. Right? And the third big change, right, is that members of the former audience, as Dan Gilmore calls them, can now also be producers and not consumers. Every time a new consumer joins this media landscape, a new producer joins as well, because the same equipment, phones, computers, let you consume and produce. It's as if when you bought a book they threw in the printing press for free. It's like you had a phone that could turn into a radio if you pressed the right buttons. Right? That is a huge change in the media landscape we're used to. And it's not just internet or no internet, right? We've had the internet in its public form for almost 20 years now. And it's still changing as the media becomes more social. It's still changing patterns, even among groups who know how to deal with the internet well. Second story. Last May, China in the Sichuan province had a terrible earthquake, 7.9 magnitude, massive destruction in a wide area, as the Richter scale has it. And the earthquake was reported as it was happening, right? People were texting from their phones. They were taking photos of buildings. They were taking videos of buildings shaking. They were uploading it to QQ, China's largest internet service. They were Twittering it, right? And so as the quake was happening, the news was reported. And because of the social connections, right? Chinese students coming elsewhere and going to school, or businesses in the rest of the world opening offices in China, right? There were people listening all over the world, hearing this news. The BBC got their first wind of the Chinese quake from Twitter. Twitter announced the existence of the quake several minutes before the US Geological Survey had anything up online for anybody to view. The last time China had a quake of that magnitude, it took them 3 months to admit that it had happened. Right? Now, they might have liked to have done that here, rather than seeing these pictures go up online. But they weren't given that choice, because their own citizens beat them to the punch. Even the government learned of the earthquake from their own citizens, rather than from the Xinhua news agency. And this stuff rippled like wildfire. For a while there, the top 10 most clicked links on Twitter, the global short messaging service, 9 of the top 10 links were about the quake. People collating information, pointing people to news sources, pointing people to the US Geological Survey. The 10th one was kittens on a treadmill, but that's the internet for you. But 9 of the 10 in those first hours, and within half a day, donation sites were up and donations were pouring in from all around the world. This is an incredible, coordinated global response. And the Chinese, then in one of their periods of media openness, decided that they were going to let it go, that they were going to let this citizen reporting flower. And then this happened. People began to figure out in the Sichuan province that the reason so many school buildings had collapsed, because tragically the earthquake happened during a school day, the reason so many school buildings collapsed is that corrupt officials had taken bribes to allow those buildings to be built to less than code. And so the citizen journalists started reporting that as well. And there was an incredible picture. You may have seen it on the front page of the New York Times. A local official literally prostrating himself in the street in front of these protesters in order to get them to go away. Essentially to say, we will do anything to placate you, just please stop protesting in public. But these are people who have been radicalized because thanks to the one-child policy, they have lost everyone in their next generation. Someone who's seen the death of a single child, right, now has nothing to lose. And so the protests kept going, and finally, the Chinese cracked down. That was enough of citizen media. And so they began to arrest the protesters. They began to shut down the media that the protests were happening on. China is probably the most successful manager of internet censorship in the world, using something that's widely described as the Great Firewall of China. And the Great Firewall of China is a set of observation points that assume that media is produced by professionals. It mostly comes in from the outside world, right? It comes in relatively sparse chunks, and it comes in relatively slowly. And because of those 4 characteristics, they are able to filter it as it comes into the country. Right? But like the Maginot Line, the Great Firewall of China was facing in the wrong direction for this challenge, because not one of those 4 things was true in this environment. Right? The media was produced locally, it was produced by amateurs, it was produced quickly, and it was produced at such an incredible abundance that there was no way to filter it as it appeared. And so now, the Chinese government, who for a dozen years has quite successfully